You know, being faced directly with the possibility of dying changes some people while it doesn't change others. Those who are stuck in the cycle of dysfunction, denial, will revert to old behaviors. But those who have combated their demons and have faced their issues realize the importance of every breath, of every human, of everything that goes on around them. And also, coming face to face with death and being faced with the prospect of dying causes you to go back and reflect upon your life. And much of my life for the last 10 years, actually 15 years now, has been researching and trying to contribute as much to mankind as one man could possibly do. And I have discovered early on that Earth was in trouble and that humans were in trouble. And we couldn't figure out why there were all these new lines in the sky that would not dissipate. They would only dissipate into a haze, unlike anything I'd ever seen growing up. And everything that I thought was a stupid, ridiculous conspiracy theory, I investigated, and each and every time I found out that most of these conspiracy theories were correct. Some were a little off, but it's not surprising when we realize that, hey, all conspiracy theories start from the existence of a single fact. And from that single fact, people draw conclusions. And if some of those conclusions are conspiracy theories, then so be it. But starting this channel, finding bizarre things on Mars that I thought would really impress people, I soon found myself immersed in a rabbit hole, trying to figure out why they were spraying in the sky, why animals were suddenly dying, why my rubber tree suddenly the leaves were turning black and falling off, why it was impossible to stay ahead of the algae in my pool, why all of a sudden it was 115 degrees in the shade. And if it's 115 degrees in the shade, what is it in direct sunlight? Seeing more and more heat-related deaths, seeing the fire seasons expand, seeing the coral and the fish stressed, seeing the temperatures go to unprecedented places, seeing weather extremes that we've never seen before, seeing jet stream disruptions that were unprecedented, seeing storms that broke records in terms of wind speed, then we had to figure out what was going on. And we found out that global warming was real. But it wasn't just global warming. We found out through our research that global warming was actually just a small fraction of the symptoms that were happening in the entire solar system. Soon the rabbit hole just led from one thing to another. We found that all the planets were changing. All the planets were heating. Their atmospheres were changing. Their magnetic fields were changing. Our magnetic field was changing. And then all of a sudden, fireballs, comets. The comets were so rare. And now thousands of them adorn and smother us in the databases with numbers that go way beyond anything that anyone could have predicted. And so, in facing death, I go back and look upon what I myself, as a single man, with the help of many people, of course, what I have been able to do towards mankind. And through this channel, I tried to change the world and was on the path to do so before my channel was taken down. And unfortunately, it was copyright strikes committed by an ex-girlfriend. And one day, 10 years of extreme pride and hard work on a single day, all of it was taken down, and yet no remorse was ever shown by the person who caused the demise of a very special channel. We were the first people to say that the Great Basin was a super mega caldera, and the reason we came to that conclusion was, well, we drove through it and saw all the volcanism. Two, we also saw that the Great Basin was surrounded by super volcanoes and massive magma flows, magma fields, and hot springs. And then, lo and behold, an underground study showed tremendous megatons of molten carbon underneath what is now the Great Basin. The supervolcanoes now in Albuquerque and Colorado were part of the Great Basin, but we know the Colorado Plateau is rotating. And those magma chambers, those calderas, have rotated into New Mexico and Colorado. Colorado was actually the source of one of the largest volcanic events geologic history has ever recorded. And then we were worried about the Planet X thing. Why? Because when David Morrison came out and said there's no such thing as Planet X, I knew he was lying. He was standing in the face of astronomers who wrote articles about Planet X. In fact, NASA didn't call it Planet X. NASA called it Nemesis. Planet X was a term that was coined long ago by Percival Lowell, who found Pluto in his search for Planet X. Well, if Planet X was passing through our solar system, then there would be all kinds of things that you should be able to predict, you would find, and you would see. But Planet X also, according to the ancients, Planet X was the reason its collision created Earth, the asteroid belt and the comet belts. And so we were one of the few channels that were saying Earth origins was not an accretion disk, but was a planetary collision between a brown dwarf star and a massive icy rocky planet. NASA has denied this, but guess who found NASA's first admission? We did. In this article, you'll see that they write and sneak out in a very slow disclosure, talking about the largest comet ever discovered. They talk and they mention and they admit that Earth was the result of a collision. That's where our water came from. They say this won't be the first time this comet has made such a trip into our solar system, since most comets observed, you get this, originated from the collision of space rocks that created Earth long ago. There is your admission. And yet this channel, if you were watching it, you already knew this fact. So then we know there has to be a cover-up, and we know that if there's more particles in the solar system, there's going to be more radiation. And we know that the electron exchange creates a background glow of X-rays in the solar system, and that if a brown dwarf, which is an electron production factory, that the brown dwarf would be showering us with electrons, electron jets, electrons from neutral hydrogen that has all its electrons. And therefore, the X-ray backgrounds would be going up. And we showed that it was. But yet we go to this chart that talks about sunspot numbers. And we look in the second column, the column that says X-ray background flux. And out of all the things they're measuring on this chart, originated by NASA or NASA affiliates, it says the X-ray background flux is what? Oh, look, there is no numerical accounting for the X-ray background flux. It's the only column that is blank. And it shouldn't be, because the X-ray flux and X-rays are being measured by dozens of instruments. There's no reason for that column to be blank. But you knew and know that the X-ray background flux was high if you watch this channel. And so we set out to prove that carbon dioxide was not our enemy, that it was a lie, that even people who love, Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, that those presidents were ignoring the reason for climate change. Earth's magnetic pole continues to drift. People try to tell us the magnetic field is weakening, which it is not. You mention this all the time. They mention it in mainstream all the time. And because there's a vacillation and a drifting of the magnetic field, people assume and people discern and people misrepresent this as a weakening of the magnetic field, which it is not. In fact, when you put more electrons into your magnetic field, you increase the voltage and you increase the magnetic signature. And also what happens, when you bring a second magnet into a system, that second magnet, and we've shown this with just using 2 magnets and a simple compass, you bring in a second magnet, and that's the quickest, easiest, most logical way to take a magnetic field that has been stable on planet Earth and suddenly destabilize it. How? A second magnet. And in this case, we call it Planet X, which basically isn't even a planet. It's a failed star, a fragment thereof. And so then we were so far ahead of our time and so far ahead of mainstream science, at least the part of science that was being publicized, because we don't think we discovered anything. We think we found what other people had found, just we weren't under the same gag orders that the other scientists were. We were also very, very outspoken that comets were not dirty snowballs, and notice how quickly NASA has gotten away from that. In fact, they talk about comets being born from what? A collision. We called comets hybrid material, part star, part rocky planet, and when you look at the nucleus of almost all comets, they almost look like they have been exposed to heat. Far cry from the snowy snowball, dirty snowball. We talked about how the helium was being focused into a cone that was hourglass shaped, and that this would light up the corona through particle collision, electron exchange, through the inverse Compton effect, through the Compton effect, which is an electron event that releases energy and light. When electrons run into photons, And when they suddenly change direction, electrons give off light. And we were so onto this that this telescope and Mauna Loa itself had to put in red lettering on their website just to counteract this channel that these images do not reflect particle concentrations. And so, what's making the corona grow brighter than it was a year ago, 2 years ago? What's brightening the corona on Mauna Loa Observatory? Well, it's the addition of extra particles. When you have very little plasma in a neon light, it glows very little. But when you increase the amount of plasma trapped inside a neon light, it grows brighter. So the amount of particles inside a neon light is directly related to the illumination given off by that light. But no, not according to Mauna Loa, which, by the way, has lost several astronomers in the past few years, mysteriously and unnaturally. So then we go to the magnetospheres, and we see that the units of measures have been changed over the years to hide the increase in energy and concentrations. But when your Earth's magnetic field has all these extra rings around it, all this extra energy, something has to give. And articles have been written, but of course they can't be honest about what's happening, and all the science magazines are just quoting NASA. No one knows where these extremely powerful cosmic rays are coming from. And of course the research is there about these high energy neutrinos. And the problem is high energy neutrinos cannot come from a proton, because protons lack the energy and the mass to create such an energetic neutrino particle. So then another particle has to be suspect. Yet all the research that's being reported is done on who and what? Protons, not helium. So then we're starting to enter an extinction. And now mainstream is talking about the sixth major extinction. I'm seeing it on TV now. They're finally admitting what we've been telling you was going to happen 10 years ago. And yet you knew about it long before everybody else because you watched this channel. And when we look, and they talk about Planet X being surrounded by iron oxide dust, we showed you articles where they found iron oxide dust increases when they passed the probes past Saturn. And then we look, and at a time when iron cosmic rays were supposed to be decreasing, we had an increase. I mean, that's a huge exponential increase. When something's supposed to go down and it accelerates up, that's a complete change in direction. So where is the iron cosmic rays coming from? It's coming from a failed brown dwarf that has collided with an iron silica based planet that once at a time was covered with ice. So the extinction moves forward, and everybody's blaming carbon dioxide. And all along, you knew it wasn't carbon dioxide. Why? Because you watch this channel and you've seen the research. Well then, what else would be pure symptoms of this Planet X? Well, the supermoons suddenly started to show up. When you research supermoons, you just go into your browser and type in supermoons, you will see that hardly an article was written about any supermoons prior to 2008.
I didn't understand that.
And so, Alexis wants me to repeat myself. The whole problem is that this supermoon phenomenon has caused flooding. And I'm so tired of seeing flooding, inland flooding, record storms, crazy weather, coastal flooding blamed on El Nino. It's El Nino's fault. Well, we've had El Nino for hundreds of years. What is different about El Nino now that we have not seen these unprecedented events prior to 2011? So the supermoons are new. Just Google supermoons and find an article that was written in 1999, 2000, 2010. I mean, you'll see ones written in 2010 because that's when the supermoons really started to become prevalent. And they were not consistent. And they were not showing up routinely year after year, except for a while, February was the most common month for supermoons and king tides. And rarely does people connect the supermoon to king tides. You know, the moon is the cause of tides. The reason we have tides is because of the moon. Now we have supermoons and king tides, and nobody wants to link them to what causes tides in the first place. But we showed you this. We showed you exactly why February was such a month. And then we tried to show you that the moon was off. And we tried to show you that they were lying about where the moon's supposed to be. And we did this by tracking all the eclipses. And when the moon is on the ecliptic, we have the most eclipses. In fact, when the moon is directly on the ecliptic, we have eclipses 30 days apart. We originally said that the moon was to cross the ecliptic in 2018, which it never did. Wikipedia once upon a time said that's when we were supposed to have the major lunar standstill. Now it's been changed. Wikipedia has been changed. So we went and we tracked all the eclipses and found what? We found that the eclipses occurred in greatest quantity in 2018. And then again in 2009. Well, from 2009 to 2018, that would be 1/2 of a draconic year. That would be when the moon crosses the ecliptic. But in 2018, it never crossed the ecliptic. It approached the ecliptic and then stayed south for another 3 years. We even have pictures of the moon south of all the planets, which were defining the ecliptic. South when? In 2019, in 2020, in 2021, when the moon was supposed to have ventured north of the ecliptic due to its regular precession. The precession, otherwise shown here, is an inclination of 5 degrees. Roughly 5 degrees. And what? Every 18.6 years, the moon crosses that ecliptic. The equator, whatever you want to call it. The moon crosses it, and it ascends through it and descends through it every 9 years. So 2009 and then 2018 is when we had the most eclipses. In fact, prior to 2017, we showed you where the moon almost passed over an occulted Regulus. Now, wait a minute. Regulus is directly on the ecliptic. So the moon was approaching the ecliptic in 2017. So why didn't it cross the ecliptic in 2019 and 2020? Well, you know why. Because you watch this channel. So then, all of these particles are creating background X-rays, background ultraviolet, background gamma, but yet lighting up the corona of the sun and just cooking Earth and breaking record after record after record. And you know how world records are. Once you break it, it's kind of hard to come back and break a record that's been set, but not when it comes to heat. We kept breaking our own heat records every 3 or 4 years. And the reason Australia takes it so harshly is because in February, Earth is closest to the sun. And if Planet X in February lines up with the sun, then when Earth goes around the sun and the moon goes around the sun with Earth, the greatest tidal influences placed upon the moon happened in February. Hence, it became more elliptical, the moon did, in its orbit in February, causing not only super king tides and super moons, but causing incredible heat down under. Well, all this heat and melting ice, and the melting ice destroys the tundra. And when you create a road, a dirt road through the trees and expose the ground in Siberia to direct sunlight, all of a sudden your dirt road starts to turn into a canyon. Why? Because the shade is no longer protecting the tundra. And that dirt road melts, erodes, destroying more trees, allowing in more radiation, and all of a sudden your warm spot, your melt spot starts to expand. This picture, it used to be a road. And because you expose that road to direct sunlight, there went the tundra. And while people cried and worried and stressed and threw in your face why carbon dioxide was evil, these mounds started developing all over the Arctic. And when they got too hot, they would explode in what is called devolatilization, releasing megatons of methane into the atmosphere. Methane, far more destructive, far more dangerous than carbon dioxide could ever hope to be. And then we find methane plumes all along the west coast, all the way from Alaska, all the way to Baja on the west coast. And these plumes, these mounds, eventually all pop. They explode, leaving behind craters. And in fact, the first one in Russia that showed up, people thought was a sinkhole. We knew with the material being blasted outwards and without there being any heat, we knew it was a gas pocket. And then what happens? An X-ray of our shallow Arctic Ocean shows lines and lines of these craters, these holes, these voids in the ocean floor where these mounds underneath the water had exploded and released methane into the atmosphere. But you knew this was going on if you watched this channel. And speaking of cover-ups, we showed, because we would show you the with your own two eyes, you know, like the intro into this video, we showed you those particles flashing in the very first frames of this video using this instrument. And then suddenly they got tired of us showing you those particles. So what did they do? They dimmed the aperture on this instrument. So what do? We keep showing you the dimmed aperture. Look how dark it is. Look how dark it is. Look how dark it is. And then last year, they overexposed. Now they overexposed the aperture, washing out some of those pinpoint emissions that we were showing you. And we always were using the plasma orientation on the surface of the sun as a means to demonstrate from which direction this helium wind was coming from. The reason the helium wind, secondary helium wind, is so important is because helium is a major component of a failed brown dwarf. So if you have more helium, you could have a brown dwarf nearby. But the absolute 100% confirmation of a brown dwarf in your solar system or near your solar system is lithium. And lithium instruments and the helium instruments have been all taken offline. I dare you to find me a lithium count. And while comets and fireballs started to overwhelm our databases, we showed you how in 2005 there was just a couple fireballs breaking the sound barrier, and then how in 2019, 2020, that number went up to 764 fireballs breaking the sound barrier. Now, how do they hide this? With stupid excuses. We showed you how geoengineering was creating all kinds of effects in the sun. We were seeing rings around the sun that we normally would not see because the reflectivity of the aluminum and the ability to cause nucleation of water. We were getting this giant ring sometimes around the sun. They said it was ice crystals, but for some reason we weren't seeing the color prisming associated with ice and water. And then pictures of the sun. Even under a filter, the sun was white hot. Even with a yellow filter, you could not make the sun look yellow. And you don't think the sun is hotter? Well, please, go spend about 3 hours in direct sunlight and don't wear a hat. We went to one of the best, most comprehensive solar measuring websites, Integrated Space Weather Analysis System, and clicked on the retired instruments, the instruments that no longer you could use to figure out what the status of your solar system was. We clicked on the retired instruments and found 30-something instruments that had been taken offline. And then we clicked on the ionosphere instruments, and there were only 5 in existence. Don't think there's a cover-up. We also showed you how, usually what affected the BZ component of our magnetosphere, and that's our own magnetosphere, was the X component in blue. The X component is the magnetic connection between Earth and the Sun. And when that deviated, so did the Z component. But suddenly, there was the Y component, which was usually ignored through most of history because it was simply Earth's connectivity to anything magnetic out in the solar system. And suddenly, the Y component was affecting the BZ component and not the X component. The X component, the magnetic field between Earth and Sun. The red line is the BY component, the magnetic connection between Earth and the outer objects in the solar system or other objects in the solar system. And then the BZ component was our own closed magnetic field. And of course, we were famous for predicting not just earthquakes, but solar flares, finding out that tidal forces also affected the solar activity. And that solar activity can create earthquakes through what? Magnetosphere compressions. We showed you how where the energy was coming from, and when we connected every single dot that you can connect. We showed you how the electrons and the protons, what was happening. Where the extra energy was coming from, not only in the sun's corona, but in our magnetosphere and in the background of the solar system itself, through what was happening with protons and electrons. And on some of the instruments, and especially the ones measuring high energy radiation, we were seeing in the corona of the sun, we were seeing consistent patterns that were very, very uniform, crisscrossing, almost like a checkerboard appearance in the instruments, showing you and proving to you that there was more than one source of that type of radiation. And in this case, which was high energy X-rays. And so when you have two different sources, these waves do not block each other out. They pass through one another like two ocean waves, creating points of high intensity and a mosaic or geometric pattern that is uniform and quite beautiful. We were also explained and showed that every time we heard these strange sounds coming from the heavens, they're kind of rare, but they happen at the beginning and end of solar cycles, was due to a harmonic vibration of our magnetosphere itself. And we went back and looked at the videos that were recording these strange sounds coming from the sky, and on those very days we found consistent, systematic, vibrational movement in our compressed magnetosphere. We also finally figured out that during these alignments with Planet X, we were having dolphin and whale strandings. And sure, we were seeing dead animals washing up on shore, which was quite concerning because usually beachings involved live animals. And we attributed those dead animals to blue-green algae and possibly sonar weapon from submarines and the Navy. But we showed how every time we had a Planet X alignment, a 90-degree alignment or a direct alignment with Jupiter, the Sun, and Planet X, with a 90-degree alignment with the Sun and Planet X, direct alignment with the Sun and Planet X, multiple alignments with Earth and Planet X, that we would have beachings. And we went back to every major beaching, and every single major beaching occurred during an alignment with a fictitious object. But we didn't stop there, because people who would lie about that would lie about other things. And so when you look at the assassination of your own president, that somebody obviously got away with, if you want to believe Harvey Oswald did it, you haven't watched enough videos on the topic and listened to other experts. But there was Madeleine Brown, the mistress of LBJ. LBJ was a crooked man. Illegitimate son from LBJ. She was being taken care of by LBJ's lawyer. She had stated that during the night before the assassination, there was a huge birthday party put on for J. Edgar Hoover by Clint Murchison, and that at that party were mobsters. And not just low-level mobsters, high-level mobsters, and politicians like John Connolly. She even said that LBJ was mad at John Connolly because he had a big mouth and that they couldn't trust him and that he might be taken care of. We showed you that when the single bullet theory was surmised to be caused by John Connolly sitting lower than John Kennedy and inward from John Kennedy, we showed you this picture where John Connolly was actually higher, or even, he was a very tall man, but his elbow was resting on the same door line, the same edge of the car as Kennedy. Does he look inbound and lower? But what was J. Edgar Hoover doing in a meeting with mobsters and politicians and CIA, Alan Dulles, ex-CIA? And what was he doing in a meeting with LBJ? And LBJ comes out and, according to Madeleine Brown, says Kennedy was going to pay. And Kennedy was about to expose another scandal LBJ was in. He'd already been busted for 2 scandals. A third one would have ended LBJ's career. And we knew John Connolly. We told you John Connolly knew something because he was part of that meeting by Madeleine Brown. And when he turned and looked, and heck, Kennedy was clutching his throat, John Connolly swore he looked around and didn't see anything suspicious. Meanwhile, Jacqueline was saying, "What's wrong, John? What's wrong?" And he's clutching his throat, and John Connolly says, "I didn't see anything suspicious when I turned and looked." So Connolly, ended up being somebody who knew a little too much. But this is important because if somebody would lie about it now, then what else are they lying about? And if they could take out a president then, what's to keep them from taking out a president now? What's to keep them from taking me out now? But unfortunately, there was nobody to corroborate Madeleine Brown's stories until the death of one very famous White House correspondent, who upon her death and in a safe deposit box, a lawyer found a letter, and she wrote down a list of names of characters at this party where she was at. And the other correspondent there was Peter Jennings, and remember, Peter Jennings died an early death. This lady was Jewish, lived to be in her 90s. Why? Probably because she had a damning letter in her safe deposit box. And guess what? She told the same story as Madeleine Brown and corroborated her story and list of the dozen people that went into a secret meeting in a secret office at Clint Murchison's house the night before the assassination, where FBI, CIA, mobsters, and politicians, and even really high up people in the U.S. Marshal's office all meted. They all met 20 minutes, a 20-minute meeting. And she corroborated Madeleine Brown's story. So then, if they could get away with that, what else are they getting away with? We start having pandemics. We start having really suspicious things happening. And so who can you believe? And as the tundra melts, and as the methane seeps devolatilize, creating craters that then fill up with water, then the water then permeates down through the permafrost and reaching ancient methane that we have never even calculated into our climate models. There's so much methane we haven't calculated that is now being released into our atmosphere. And so, you know this is going on because you watch this channel. You know it's not a conspiracy. It's not even a theory. It's factual. And I've shown you with your own 2 naked eyes things that prove it. And so when people were saying we were crazy for calling the Great Basin a super mega caldera, we asked, okay, what piece of land on planet Earth has more hot springs than any other piece of land? People said Yellowstone. Wrong answer. Yellowstone is a supervolcano. Where? On the edge of the Great Basin. Why is a Great Basin surrounded by supervolcanoes? And so, but right in the heart of the Great Basin, the middle of this mega super caldera, the one where they found all this liquid carbon, what's underneath and what's on top? Well, what's on top are hot springs. More hot springs in this piece of land than anywhere on planet Earth. So, the United States is, half the United States is a mega super volcano that on the rims spawn supervolcanoes that are thought to be extinct. But you cannot call Yellowstone extinct. We showed you how these increased particles in 2004 caused increased ultraviolet. In 2004, they raised the UV index that topped at 10. And what was the top level of the UV index after 2004? Well, there was no top. You had a scale that topped out at 10, now 11 and above. We showed you the differences between air temperatures and ground temperatures. And when, of course, the Weather Channel and the news started talking about what asphalt and concrete would be, because, people were getting injured by this, they had to make you aware they could not keep this secret because it's a white elephant in the room. They underreported the changes and the differences in temperature. So these next readings I'm showing you occurred when the temperature was 80 degrees in the air. Dashboard temperature was 197. Ground temperature, 137. Well, that's slightly different than what mainstream had been reporting. Concrete versus asphalt, 145 and 125 degrees. Yes, but the air temperature wasn't even 80 degrees. Well, didn't quite match up. Was kind of underreported, wasn't it? When they tell you asphalt temperatures were 130 degrees at 85 degree air temperatures, and in actuality, at 80 degrees, it was 134 degrees. Concrete temperature. And the concrete temperatures they were telling you was 105 degrees. Asphalt temperature, 145. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is alarming. And we had to figure out what was going on, and all in all, we found actual scientific diagrams of the helium focusing cone. Now they have to keep this a secret. So what do? They don't call it a focusing cone. They call it an interstellar cloud. Like this stuff's coming from outer space. But why is it being focused by our sun? Usually anything focused by our sun is part of our solar system. It's not interstellar, it's interplanetary. And then we see this article. Again, mystery particles spewing from Antarctica defies physics. Bull crap. Nothing on planet Earth defies physics. And anybody who tells you something defies physics doesn't have all the facts or doesn't understand physics. And what would cause, hydrogen can't release. Hydrogen, we have these super colliders. We can't even get high energy neutrinos out of those particle collisions. So where are they coming from? We don't know. It's a mystery. Well, when we start reading articles about helium and we see an article that, I'm going to read this directly to you, the reactions of helium charge exchange between helium and hydrogen, these reactions are 250 times lower than the helium-helium charge exchange. So when helium and hydrogen exchange electrons, it's 250 times less energy and gives you a low glow of background radiation that you see in the entire sky. But the helium-helium charge exchange is 250 times more energetic. And yet, when people try to find out where the mystery article, where the mystery particles are coming from, what do they tell you? Well, then we don't know because hydrogen can't do it. Well, then quit looking at hydrogen.
I didn't understand that.
So here we go. We showed you the changes with your own naked eye in every single planet in the solar system. Changes in the visual appearance of all planets and even their moons. Changing throughout the years, but the biggest changes occurred around 2010 and 2011. So what would cause the sun suddenly to go from a yellow sun to a white sun? Well, we showed you that when you mix light, it's not the same thing as mixing paint. And that most electrons release blue light. When you see electrons jump in a spark, it's blue. When you see arcing, a lot of times it's blue. And when you mix blue with yellow, you get white. So if you have additional blue light, that's more light, increased light. Plus, it's also white. The other thing causing white light is particle collision. Electrons themselves can create white light, but it has to be a result of a collision and not a change in direction or speed. So we showed you article after article after article about this helium. Not only because it's the reason Earth is dying, it's because it's proof of Planet X. And it's proof that carbon dioxide is a scapegoat. And not only did they quote Ulysses, they quote other spacecraft called Messenger, they quote other spacecraft called IBEX. I mean, they just, they have studied this a lot, but yet funny how nobody talks about it. And you knew about it. You're one of the very fortunate few people on planet Earth to know about this. Why? Because you watch this channel. So, and then we found an article about what a rapid change. Remember, we saw a change in the instruments. We saw them downgrading the appearance of the concentration of particles by changing the units they were measuring. You will get fewer particles if you measure cubic centimeters versus cubic meters. You would think a cubic meter would hold more water than a cubic centimeter, right? So what would hold more particles? So when all of a sudden, you get 10,000 times less area or volume that you're measuring, and yet your particle count remains the same, that's a huge increase in the concentration of particles. And we found articles that substantiated, finally, what we had been telling you for years. And then we noticed a shifting in the periodicity of earthquakes and the periodicity of the solar storms, the periodicity in the speed of the solar wind. And we said that because this planet X was getting closer, we said that cloud, it's not a cloud. I mean, if there's an upwind and downwind, an upstream and downstream, which they mention over and over in these articles I'm showing you, it can't be a cloud. It's a stream. And they talked about how the interstellar wind has changed direction. Why? Well, because Planet X got closer, and as something gets closer, its relative position changes faster. So then SpaceX SpaceX all of a sudden loses 40 satellites during a really minor solar storm. And see, when you keep this stuff secret, when you're sailing your spaceship through densities of particles that are being kept from you, it's hard to figure out the drag. And so then all of a sudden you have a minor CME, particles come racing through, and the drag on your spaceship is incredible, and all of a sudden 40 satellites fall from Earth. They didn't malfunction, they fell from Earth. And yes, some of those particles were iron. Well, then if there was more particles, how could you discern it with your naked eye? Well, just look at the white auroras. White auroras are rare, but they're becoming less rare. We showed you articles that reported on the white auroras. They called white auroras Steve. I do not know why. But we told you that they were electrons, that really wasn't a plasma event as much as it was an electron event. So when the electrons smashed into the plasma, you would get the white light. And then the background X-rays. We showed you instruments, 2018 and 2011, where the blue line, high energy, the blue line is high energy X-rays. We're down to almost 10 to the minus 9. And then as of 2019, went up to 10 to the minus 8. And today, in 2023, the background X-rays are up to 10 to the minus 7. And we told you, you knew this was going to happen if you watched this channel, because we told you 2023 was going to be a make it or break it year, because that will be the first onset of solar maximum in 2023, where X-rays coming off the sun are going to combine with the X-rays being created already in the corona and our magnetosphere and just in the background solar system itself. 10 to the minus 7 from 10 to the minus 9 is 100-fold increase in X-rays. And the sun we knew was brighter because all of a sudden we were seeing moons when we shouldn't see the moon. And the late new moon was visible when the sun hadn't even completely set. It was a sliver, and anytime you increase the light behind a sphere, you will illuminate the edges of that sphere. And therefore, we had the sliver of a moon, which was actually then glowing on the rest of the moon, creating what they call earthshine, but it's not earthshine, it's sunshine. And again, stuff that you don't have to be a scientist, stuff you can see with your naked eye. But then the surface plasma on the sun started twisting. The loops, the magnetic loops that were nice and symmetrical, started to twist. And so we showed you an electron loop in a laboratory. When exposed to an external magnetic field, looped upon itself, created a figure 8 or a spiral. Just like the magnetic loops on the sun were doing, meaning a secondary magnetic field was now influencing the surface loops on the sun. Imagine that, a second magnet. So, when you look at what happens when you're exposed to cosmic radiation, they talk about what happens to you. They talk about cardiac events, brain inflammation, mood changes, and behavior. They talk about it. So when all of a sudden the background X-rays, which used to be at 10 to the minus 9, are now 10 to the minus 7, then what do you think's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen to the temperatures, the ground temperatures, the water temperatures. But don't take my word for it. You know, a lot of Christian people are telling me I'm crazy. Well, read your Bible and tell me your Bible is crazy. The fourth angel poured his bowl onto the sun, and the sun was allowed to scorch people with fire and burn the flesh of man. Don't believe me. Don't take my word for it. Read your Bible. So the extinction has started. We told you it was starting. We talked about these die-offs a long, long time ago, and that because of this, mankind was going to make a move. And then we see all these directed energy weapons where they do surveillance, they control your brain, they put it out over TV, they put it into music files, they talk about identifying whether you're lying or telling the truth just by measuring the magnetic field around your brain, how they could identify your identity through a wall. Yeah, that's nice fun. Huh? That's a beautiful thing. And we showed you those patents. So when people talk about directed energy weapons, I used to think there was a conspiracy. Not anymore. So when food is it getting scarcer, or is it more scarce? When food prices are going through the ceiling, what would the government do to accentuate your need for government? What would they do to put you behind the eight ball and more dependent upon them? Well, in a time where you should never allow the restriction of fertilizer shipments, they restricted fertilizer shipments. And as processing warehouses were burning to the ground, as this was going on, they were restricting what? They were restricting shipments of fertilizer to the farmers who grow your food. So, but you knew about all of it. You had the answers to all of this. You knew, you were like one of the 1/100th% of the population that actually knew what was going on. And we were warning you about mankind. Be more afraid of mankind than the solar system. Respect the solar system, but fear mankind. What was mankind going to do to A, reduce the population, to get control of the masses? And then all of a sudden, well, you know what happened. And now facing us is the war in Ukraine. And every day, they talk about Russia utilizing a nuclear option. So that is why I am proud, and being faced with death and looking death in the face and wondering when that day is going to come, if it's just around the corner, can I prolong it another year? Being faced with death has made me look back and feel proud of what I tried to do for my fellow man. And I do offer my apologies. You know, once we opened a store, you know, with Karen, she took an antidepressant and then wigged out, went crazy, basically. Did things that were actually more harmful to her than helpful to her. Actually, she was the reason my channel was taken down, because she created the copyright strikes using my AdSense accounts. And, you know, that was a woman whose life I saved. So, you know, every time I try to have a store, something bad happens that makes it hard to have a store. COVID, though, was a game changer. You know, it was you couldn't ship product in the containers you wanted. the mail was running late. And then they started opening my mail and intercepting my mail, hacking my computers. And I pulled my hard drive out, put it on an external drive, went through my external drive. I want to share with you every single picture analysis of Gale Crater on Mars. All those anomalies, all those humanoids that I had shown you, every single Gale Crater photo had been removed off my hard drive. Imagine that. Even after I pulled my hard drive out, none of those pictures were there. Where did they go? I didn't delete thousands of pictures. Somebody took them all. And then my computer went poof, goodbye. So to think that little old me could create such a stir and be such a concern to Big Brother, just one guy, and a few people that I consider part of the team, tells me I was doing great things. And I may never be acknowledged for it. My family may never recognize it and fully understand what I have done for mankind. But it's not their judgment that matters in the end. What the judgment that matters most is of my children, my judgment of myself, but also judgment from a higher power that transcends Big Brother. And when I look back, how this channel was the only one to arrange its own music. How many discoveries that we have made that have now been proven true. All the Mars images that have just caused us to really rethink everything we knew about NASA and our government and about life and the origins of life. And I do want to add this one last thing when I'm talking about origins of life and Mars and extraterrestrials. The existence of extraterrestrials does not disprove the sanctity of your God. In fact, even the Catholic Church has acknowledged that the existence of extraterrestrials would only support the grandness and the greatness of God. But I kind of wonder if our God isn't an extraterrestrial being in whose likeness we were created using DNA. Now think about this. This is a parting thought. Just something for you to think about as you go to sleep tonight. 95 to 97% of our DNA, they call junk DNA. 3 to 5% of our DNA is actually active in replicating and making proteins and growing tissues, while the rest of that DNA is just there. It may be templates, but the bottom line is, what would happen to the human race if all of our DNA was activated? We have mammals that have sonar. We have animals that can create an electrical field over the skin and shock you like an electric eel. We have animals that glow. We have animals that can see at night. We have animals that have extrasensory freakiness about them. We have animals that have hearing that go way beyond what you could ever imagine. We have animals that can sense electromagnetism. We have animals like birds that can sense magnetic fields. What would happen to the human race if our DNA was allowed to become activated? What kind of super beings would we become? And how much closer to godlike would we be? So, as I embark on a new chapter in my life, one that involves a fight for my own life, I want to say to you that I am grateful for what you have brought for me and done for me. I am sorry if my store did not meet your expectations. I try to make everything right, and I'm still trying. I'm decorating this house. It's a dream home on a golf course, one where a hawk visited me on my first day. I almost bumped it with my elbow. I mean, imagine that. How many times has that happened? So I'm in the right place. I'm doing the right things. But I still do not know what future holds for me. But regardless, sometimes your gratitude and your humbleness reach a certain point at which no words can describe the feelings that you are feeling. And so, in saying such, the best that I can do is that if you're listening to my voice right now, the only thing I can say is thank you.